I have been many years training in the way of strategy. The character for way is read Michi in Japanese, or Do in Chinese-based reading. It is equivalent to the Chinese Dao, and means the whole of life of the warrior, his devotion to the sword, and his place in the system. The divine footprints of God pointing the way. Strategy, or heiho, is a word of Chinese derivation meaning military strategy. Hei means soldier, and ho means method or form. It is now during the first 10 days of the 10th month, 1645, and I have climbed the mountain Iwato of Higo to pay homage to heaven and kneel before Buddha. I am a warrior of Harima Province, Shinmen Oshashi no Kami Fujiwara no Genshin, age 60 years. From youth, my heart has been inclined toward the way of strategy, or the sword. My first duel when I was 13, I struck down a strategist or swordsman of the Shinto school, one Arima Kihei. When I was 16, I struck down an able strategist, Tadashima Akiyama. When I was 21, I went up to the capital and met all manner of strategists, never once failing to win in many contests. After that, I went from province to province, dueling with strategists of various schools, and not once failed to win, even though I had as many as 60 encounters. This was between the ages of 13 and 28 or 29. When I reached 30, I looked back on my past. The previous victories were not due to my having mastered strategy. Perhaps it was natural ability, or the order of heaven, or that other school strategies were inferior. After that, I studied morning and evening, searching for the principle, and came to realize the way of strategy when I was 50. Since then, I've lived without following any particular way. Thus, the virtue of strategy, I practice many arts and abilities, all things with no teacher. To write this book, I did not use the law of Buddha, or the teachings of Confucius, neither old war chronicles, nor books on martial tactics. I take up my brush to explain the true spirit of this Ichi school, as it is mirrored in the way of heaven and Kwannon, Buddhism's goddess of mercy. The time is the night of the 10th day of the 10th month, and the hour of the tiger, 3 to 5 a.m. The Ground Book. Strategy is the craft of the warrior. Commanders must enact the craft, and troopers should know this way. There is no warrior in the world today who really understands the way of strategy. There are various ways. There is the way of salvation by the law of Buddha, the way of Confucius governing the way of learning, the way of healing as a doctor, as a poet teaching the way of waka, tea, archery, and many other arts and skills. Each man practices as he feels inclined. It is said the warrior's is the twofold way of pen and sword, and he should have a taste for both ways. Even if a man has no natural ability, he can be a warrior by sticking assiduously to both divisions of the way. Generally speaking, the way of the warrior is resolute acceptance of death. This idea can be summed up as the philosophy expounded in Hagakure, or Hidden Leaves, a book written in the 17th century by Yamamoto Tsunenori and a few other samurai of the province Nabeshima-han, present-day Saga. Although not only warriors, but priests, women, peasants, and lowlier folk have been known to die readily in the cause of duty or out of shame, this is a different thing. The warrior is different in that studying the way of strategy is based on overcoming men. By victory gained in crossing swords with individuals or in joining battle with large numbers, we can attain power and fame for ourselves or our Lord. This is the virtue of strategy. Even an unadaptable man who is completely useless is a most trusted retainer if he does nothing more than think earnestly of his Lord's welfare. To think only of the practical benefit of wisdom and technology is vulgar. So when you embark upon something, before you start, fix your intention on the 4 oaths and put selfishness behind you. Then you cannot fail. The 4 oaths. Never be late with respect to the way of the warrior. Be useful to the Lord. Be respectful to your parents. Get beyond love and grief. Exist for the good of man. The way of strategy. In China and Japan, practitioners of the way have been known as masters of strategy. Warriors must learn this way. Recently, there have been people getting on in the world as strategists, but they are usually just sword fencers. The attendants of the Kashima Kantoril's shrine of the province Hitachi received instruction from the gods, and made schools based on this teaching, traveling from country to country instructing men. This is the most recent meaning of strategy. In olden times, strategy was listed among the 10 abilities and 7 arts as a beneficial practice. It was certainly an art, but as a beneficial practice, it was not limited to sword fencing. The true value of sword fencing cannot be seen within the confines of sword fencing technique. If we look at the world, we see arts for sale. Men use equipment to sell their own selves, as if with the nut and the flower, the nut has become less than the flower. In this kind of way of strategy, both those teaching and those learning the way are concerned with coloring and showing off the technique, trying to hasten the bloom of the flower. They speak of this dojo and that dojo. They are looking for profit. Someone once said, "Immature strategy is the cause of grief." That was a true saying. There are 4 ways in which men pass through life: as gentlemen, farmers, artisans, and merchants. The way of the farmer. Using agricultural instruments, he sees springs through to autumns with an eye on the changes of season. Second is the way of the merchant. The winemaker obtains his ingredients and puts them to use to make his living. The way of the merchant is always to live by taking profit. This is the way of the merchant. Thirdly, the gentleman warrior, carrying the weaponry of his way. The way of the warrior is to master the virtue of his weapons. If a gentleman dislikes strategy, he will not appreciate the benefit of weaponry, so must he not have a little taste for this? Fourthly, the way of the artisan. The way of the carpenter is to become proficient in the use of his tools, first to lay his plans with a true measure, and then perform his work according to plan. Thus he passes through life. These are the 4 ways of the gentleman, the farmer, the artisan, and the merchant. Comparing the way of the carpenter to strategy. Here, carpenter means both architect and builder, as well as carpenter. The comparison with carpentry is through the connection with houses. Houses of the nobility, houses of warriors, the 4 houses, ruin of houses, thriving of houses, the style of the house, the tradition of the house, and the name of the house. The carpenter uses a master plan of the building, and the way of strategy is similar in that there is a plan of campaign. If you want to learn the craft of war, ponder over this book. The teacher is as a needle. The disciple is as thread. You must practice constantly. Like the foreman carpenter, the commander must know natural rules, and the rules of the country, and the rules of houses. This is the way of the foreman. The foreman carpenter must know the architectural theory of towers and temples, and the plans of palaces, and must employ men to raise up houses. The way of the foreman carpenter is the same as the way of the commander of a warrior house. In the construction of houses, choice of woods is made. Straight unknotted timber of good appearance is used for the revealed pillars. Straight timber with small defects is used for the inner pillars. Timber of the finest appearance, even if a little weak, is used for the thresholds, lintels, doors, and sliding doors, and so on. Good, strong timber, though it be gnarled and knotted, can always be used discreetly in construction. Timber which is weak or knotted throughout should be used as scaffolding and later for firewood. The foreman carpenter allots his men work according to their ability. Floor layers, makers of sliding doors, thresholds and lintels, ceilings, and so on. Those of poor ability lay the floor joists, and those of lesser ability carve wedges and do such miscellaneous work. If the foreman knows and deploys his men well, the finished work will be good. The foreman should take into account the abilities and limitations of his men, circulating among them and asking nothing unreasonable. He should know their morale and spirit and encourage them when necessary. This is the same as the principle of strategy. The way of strategy. Like a trooper, the carpenter sharpens his own tools. He carries his equipment in his toolbox and works under the direction of his foreman. He makes columns and girders with an axe, shapes floorboards and shelves with a plane, cuts fine openwork and carvings accurately, giving as excellent a finish as his skill will allow. This is the craft of the carpenters. When the carpenter becomes skilled and understands measures, he can become a foreman. The carpenter's attainment is having tools which will cut well to make small shrines, writing shelves, tables, paper lanterns, chopping boards, and pot lids. These are the specialties of the carpenter. Things are similar for the trooper. You want to think deeply about this. The attainment of the carpenter is that his work is not warped, that the joints are not misaligned, and that the work is truly planed so that it meets well and is not merely finished in sections. This is essential. If you want to learn this way, deeply consider the things written in this book one at a time. You must do sufficient research. The outline of the 5 books of this book of strategy. 5 books, or Go-Rin no Sho, means a book of 5 rings. The Godai, the 5 greats of Buddhism, are the 5 elements which make up the cosmos: ground, water, fire, wind, and void. The Go-Rin, the 5 rings of Buddhism, are the 5 parts of the human body: head, left and right elbows, and left and right knees. The way is shown as 5 books concerning different aspects. These are ground, water, fire, wind or tradition, and void. The body of the way of strategy from the viewpoint of my Ichi school is explained in the ground book. It is difficult to realize the true way just through sword fencing. Know the smallest things and the biggest things, the shallowest things and the deepest things, as if it were a straight road mapped out on the ground. The first book is called the ground book. Second is the water book. With water as the basis, the spirit becomes like water. Water adopts the shape of its receptacle. It is sometimes a trickle and sometimes a wild sea. Water has a clear blue color. By the clarity, things of Ichi school are shown in this book. If you master the principles of sword fencing, when you freely beat one man, you beat any man in the world. The spirit of defeating a man is the same for 10 million men. The strategist makes small things into big things, like building a great Buddha from a 1-foot model. I cannot write in detail how this is done. The principle of strategy is having one thing to know 10,000 things. Things of Ichi school are written in this, the water book. Third is the fire book. This book is about fighting. The spirit of fire is fierce, whether the fire be small or big, and so it is with battles. The way of battles is the same for man-to-man fights and for 10,000-a-side battles. You must appreciate that spirit can become big or small. What is big is easy to perceive. What is small is difficult to perceive. In short, it is difficult for large numbers of men to change position so their movements can be easily predicted. An individual can easily change his mind, so his movements are difficult to predict. You must appreciate this. The essence of this book is that you must train day and night in order to make quick decisions. In strategy, it is necessary to treat training as a part of normal life, with your spirit unchanging. Thus, combat in battle is described in the Fire Book. Fourthly, the Wind Book. This book is not concerned with my Ichi school, but with other schools of strategy. By wind, I mean old traditions, present-day traditions, and family traditions of strategy. Thus, I clearly explain the strategies of the world. This is tradition. It is difficult to know yourself if you do not know others. To all ways, there are sidetracks. If you study a way daily, and your spirit diverges, you may think you are obeying a good way. But objectively, it is not the true way. If you are following the true way and diverge a little, this will later become a large divergence. You must realize this. Other strategies have come to be thought of as mere sword fencing, and it is not unreasonable that this should be so. The benefit of my strategy, although it includes sword fencing, lies in a separate principle. I have explained what is commonly meant by strategy in other schools in the Tradition or Wind Book. Fifthly, the Book of the Void. By void, I mean that which has no beginning and no end. Attaining this principle means not attaining the principle. The way of strategy is the way of nature. When you appreciate the power of nature, knowing the rhythm of any situation, you will be able to hit the enemy naturally and strike naturally. All this is the way of the void. I intend to show you how to follow the true way, according to nature, in the Book of the Void. The Name Ichi Ryo Nito. One school, two swords. Warriors, both commanders and troopers, carry two swords at their belt. In olden times, these were called the long sword and the sword. Nowadays they are known as the sword and the companion sword. Let it suffice to say that in our land, whatever the reason, a warrior carries two swords at his belt. It is the way of the warrior. Nito Ichi Ryu shows the advantage of using both swords. Students of the Ichi school way of strategy should train from the start with the sword and long sword in either hand. Note that the samurai wore two swords thrust through the belt with the cutting edges upward on the left side. The shorter or companion sword was carried at all times, and the longer sword worn only out of doors. From time to time, there were rules governing the style and length of swords. Samurai carried two swords, but other classes were allowed only one sword for protection against brigands on the roads between towns. This is a truth. When you sacrifice your life, you must make fullest use of your weaponry. It is false not to do so, and to die with a weapon yet undrawn. If you hold a sword with both hands, it is difficult to wield it freely to left and right, so my method is to carry the sword in one hand. This does not apply to large weapons such as the spear or halberd, but swords and companion swords can be carried in one hand. To hold the long sword in both hands is not the true way, for if you carry a bow or spear or other arms in your left hand, you have only one hand free for the long sword. However, when it is difficult to cut an enemy down with one hand, you must use both hands. It is not difficult to wield a sword in one hand. The way to learn this is to train with two long swords, one in each hand. It will seem difficult at first, but everything is difficult at first. Bows are difficult to draw, halberds are difficult to wield. As you become accustomed to the bow, so your pull will become stronger. When you become used to wielding the long sword, you will gain the power of the way and wield the sword well. As I will explain in the second book, the Water Book, there is no fast way of wielding the long sword. The long sword should be wielded broadly, and the companion sword closely. This is the first thing to realize. According to this Ichi school, you can win with a long weapon, and yet you can also win with a short weapon. In short, the way of the Ichi school is the spirit of winning, whatever the weapon and whatever its size. It is better to use 2 swords rather than 1 when you are fighting a crowd, and especially if you want to take a prisoner. These things cannot be explained in detail. From one thing, know 10,000 things. When you attain the way of strategy, there will not be one thing you cannot see. You must study hard. The benefit of the 2 characters reading strategy. Masters of the long sword are called strategists. We do not call masters of the way of the long sword long swordsmen, nor do we speak of companion swordsmen, because bows, guns, spears, and halberds are all warriors' equipment. They are certainly part of strategy. To master the virtue of the long sword is to govern the world and oneself. Thus the long sword is the basis of strategy. The principle is strategy by means of the long sword. If he attains the virtue of the long sword, 1 man can beat 10 men. Just as 1 man can beat 10, so 100 men can beat 1,000, and 1,000 can beat 10,000. In my strategy, 1 man is the same as 10,000, so this strategy is the complete warrior's craft. The way of the warrior does not include other ways, such as Confucianism, Buddhism, certain traditions, artistic accomplishments, and dancing. But even though these are not part of the way, if you know the way broadly, you will see it in everything. Men must polish their particular way. The benefit of weapons in strategy. There is a time and a place for use of weapons. The best use of the companion sword is in a confined space or when you are engaged closely with an opponent. The long sword can be used effectively in all situations. Anyway, if you learn indoor or dojo techniques exclusively, you will think narrowly and forget the true way. Thus you will have difficulty in actual encounters. Just as a horse must have endurance and no defects, so it is with weapons. Horses should walk strongly, and swords and companion swords should cut strongly. Spears and halberds must stand up to heavy use. Bows and guns must be sturdy. Weapons should be hardy rather than decorative. You should not have a favorite weapon. To become overfamiliar with 1 weapon is as much a fault as not knowing it sufficiently well. You should not copy others, but use weapons which you can handle properly. It is bad for commanders and troopers to have likes and dislikes. These are things you must learn thoroughly. Timing in strategy. There is timing in everything. Timing in strategy cannot be mastered without a great deal of practice. Timing is important in dancing and pipe or string music, for they are in rhythm only if timing is good. Timing and rhythm are also involved in the military arts, shooting bows and guns and riding horses. In all skills and abilities, there is timing. There is also timing in the void. There is timing in the whole life of the warrior, in his thriving and declining, in his harmony and discord. Similarly, there is timing in the way of the merchant, in the rise and fall of capital. All things entail rising and falling timing. You must be able to discern this. In strategy, there are various timing considerations. From the outset, you must know the applicable timing and the inapplicable timing. And from among the large and small things and the fast and slow timings, find the relevant timing, first seeing the distance timing and the background timing. This is the main thing in strategy. It is especially important to know the background timing, otherwise your strategy will become uncertain. You win in battles with the timing in the void, born of the timing of cunning by knowing the enemy's timing, and thus using a timing which the enemy does not expect. All the 5 books are chiefly concerned with timing. You must train sufficiently to appreciate all this. If you practice day and night in the above Ichi school strategy, your spirit will naturally broaden. Thus is large-scale strategy and the strategy of hand-to-hand combat propagated in the world. This is recorded for the first time in the 5 books of ground, water, fire, tradition or wind, and void. This is the way for men who want to learn my strategy. 1. Do not think dishonestly. 2. The way is in training. 3. Become acquainted with every art. 4. Know the ways of all professions. 5. Distinguish between gain and loss in worldly matters. 6. Develop intuitive judgment and understanding for everything. 7. Perceive those things which cannot be seen. 8. Pay attention even to trifles. 9. Do nothing which is of no use. It is important to start by setting these broad principles in your heart and train in the way of strategy. If you do not look at things on a large scale, it will be difficult for you to master strategy. If you learn and attain this strategy, you will never lose, even to 20 or 30 enemies. More than anything to start with, you must set your heart on strategy and earnestly stick to the way. You will come to be able to actually beat men in fights, and to be able to win with your eye. Also by training, you will be able to freely control your own body, conquer men with your body, and with sufficient training you will be able to beat 10 men with your spirit. When you have reached this point, will it not mean that you are invincible? Moreover, in large-scale strategy, the superior man will manage many subordinates dexterously, bear himself correctly, govern the country, and foster the people, thus preserving the ruler's discipline. If there is a way involving the spirit of not being defeated, to help oneself and to gain honor, it is the way of strategy. The 2nd year of Shoho, 1645, the 5th month, the 12th day. Signed, Shinmin Musashi. To Teruo Maganojo, the pupil, sometimes called Teruo Nobuyuki, to whom Musashi addressed Gorin no Sho.